Hello everyone, welcome to our discussion of Chapter 8. We are going to get into process costing. As you'll remember, Chapter 6 and 7, we introduced the idea of job costing, of allocating overhead, that sort of thing, coming up with a cost per unit or cost per job when we were doing job costing. We talked a little bit about operation costing as a combination between the two, and we introduced the idea of process costing, which is when we have this kind of continuous flow, not individual, unique, customized jobs. So if we look at the cost flow, job costing, each thing is going to the individual job. So as long as you identify the direct costs by job, and allocate the overhead, then the cost per job is not hard to find because there's a start and stop. You don't have to do a lot of estimating of when it started and stopped and that sort of thing. Process costing, you remember, is a continuous flow. So one of our biggest challenges is kind of trying to, you might say, hit a moving target in the sense that the costs are constantly being added. There is no start and stop. There's no customization. All of them go through the same processes, and that could be several. Process A, B, C as it shows, and they can go, some could go A to C, some products could go A, B, C. That's what we need to handle. Now we're going to keep it pretty straightforward and have them basically go through the same processes, but once you get the hang of each process, you're going to handle each department, and that's how we're going to determine these processes, each process or each department separately. And once you've got that, you can literally do that as many departments as you need. Okay, once you get the hang of it, just like job costing, having 10 jobs is not that much more complicated than having 5 jobs. Okay, process costing, having 6 departments is not that much more complicated than 3, as long as you can understand what the inputs and outputs are. So we introduced in Chapter 6 the idea of equivalent units. It's much more important to have this down pat when we talk about process costing, because it's our way of trying to freeze what's happening on a continuous basis, is to look at things that are partway done, okay, in terms of all the way finished, okay? So if we were determining equivalent units, now this is a case where we have 3 cans of paint, each one is filled differently, and we take an average. Now, what I want to make sure we understand is equivalent units or percent complete is always an estimate, and therefore it has some level of judgment that goes into it. There is no exact science to doing this. But what we're saying is between these 3 cans of paint, okay, they're 65% complete. So 3 times 65%, okay, or 1.9 would give us the equivalent units. So instead of being 3 gallons, it's actually the equivalent of just under 2, because it's not fully complete. So when we want to compare how much work we've done or how much materials we've done, we need to know those partially, our work in process, partially done units. How far along are they? How much of the percentage of the materials have been added? How much of the labor and overhead has been added in terms of where we are in the process and how much complete we are, so we can compare that to what the work would be to complete an entire unit and to have it all the way done. And this comes up because we're going to kind of freeze it at the end of the month when stuff is partially done. So you never have to do that job costing because you don't have to really worry about moving the job to finished goods until it's all done. But in a process costing, as things roll off the assembly line, if you will, they're moved to finished goods. And so some are still on the assembly line, some are still being worked on at the same time as some have moved on to the next process. All right? And so rather than moving as a group, they kind of move in a flow. So process costing involves 5 steps. And we're going to learn how to do it using 2 assumptions. One, weighted average, which we also covered in Accounting 161, and the first in, first out assumption, which sounds familiar from earlier accounting classes, but you have not done before in terms of process costing. The 5 steps are the same for both. Okay, so there's still 5 steps. It doesn't change the steps at all. It just slightly changes how we calculate, how we do step 2, okay, and step 3. And therefore get a different answer for step 4. But so we'll come back and compare that once we have an understanding of what these steps happen. So our example we're going to use for our slides, all right, is this Apple State Juices, who produces and bottles various fruit juices. So we first take the apples, we shred them, we then press them, then we pasteurize them, and then we are finished goods and they go to our warehouse. Okay, so that's our 3 departments, our 3 processes, if you will, and we probably run it 24/7. Okay, as a batch is finished up in the shredding department, it moves to the pressing department. Okay, and once it's done being pressed, it moves to the pasteurization and packaging department. So we have to do our accounting and these 5 steps, if you will, for each department. All right. And literally, as you can see here, we're going to build a spreadsheet. And once you have built the spreadsheet in Excel, it's not that hard to do each month. So we're going to do this typically, it's one thing, a month's worth of accounting to keep track. I mean, you could wait till the end of the year, but it seems like if you want to really see where your costs are, you're going to want it more often than once a year. So in this shredding department, just getting a feel for what's happening, we have, and this is the case with every department we're working on, what was what was in process on March 1st. So we took a snapshot on March 1, and at that point in time, we had 20,000 units sitting, partially done in the shredding department. All right, and remember, shredding department is our first department. So that was the first thing, and they are 25% complete with respect to conversion costs. And conversion costs, remember, are labor and overhead, direct labor and overhead. All of the materials, direct materials, have been added because that's why you start. You start by putting all the materials into your shredder, but it's not completely done. It takes a while to complete, and there are only 25%. This 20,000 gallons, okay, is only 25% complete. During the month of March, we brought in another 90,000 gallons of pulp. Okay? Over the course of the month, we transferred out to the next department 96,000 which means we still have at the end of the month 16,000 in work in process. Anytime you have a work in process number, you need to know what percent complete, because obviously it's not 100%, or it would be finished goods and be moved, or it would be moved to the next department, whichever. If it's done, it would be finished goods. If it's just moved to the next department, it would be moved. We're not going to let it just sit there. So on March 31st, there were some we were still working on, 16,000 gallons, in fact, that we're still shredding, and they happen to be estimated 30% done. 100% done for materials, 30% for conversion costs. So you should always ask yourself that with work in process. You've got a beginning here, you got an ending here. You can use the dates, you can say beginning, ending, however makes it most sense to you. All right. Then we calculate our equivalent units. Notice that things that are transferred out, right, physical units, we transferred out 96 from step 1. Those have to be 100% complete, right? For everything. They didn't get transferred until they were done for materials and for conversion costs. Again, conversion costs are labor and overhead. But also, the ending work in process also needs to be considered for equivalent units. This is where this whole idea of equivalent units is so important, because these are, for at least conversion, are only part way done. So the stuff that's sitting there at the end of the month, partially done, all the materials are there. So that's all 16,000. But we have only done the work to shred them 30%. So we take the 16,000 and we multiply it by that 30%, we get 4,800. That converts it to an equivalent unit measure. Then we look at our costs to assign to our products. So now we're talking about dollars. So far we've only been talking about units, gallons, equivalent units. Now we're talking about dollars. This is what we had in work in process. So if you imagine your T account, all right, there would be in your work in process, and I tell students that most of the time, if you really want your system to run in process costing, you're going to have a T account for each department's work in process. So work in process, shredding department would have had 24,286 when we started the month. That's the dollar amount that would have been in that T account. 16 of that, 16,160 were materials, 8,126 were conversion costs. During the month of March, as people worked, as we added materials, as we brought them in, okay, as we incurred overhead, allocated overhead to that department, shredding department, that we added 298,274 of costs during the month. 84,640 were materials, 213,634 were labor and overhead conversion costs. All right? So that comes from our normal accounting. So you can kind of imagine trying to track your direct labor to that department. Now, it's a little easier than job costing because typically your workers are going to be assigned to a department, right? So worker A is going to work in the shredding department. That's their job. And so we don't have to worry too much about their time card or knowing, because we just know all of their hours are on the shredding department because that's where they work. Now, when weird things happen, like for instance, something goes haywire in a department, you have to pull workers in from another department or something like that, then you may need to keep that track of that. But it's a little easier to keep track of because people are assigned. If that's not the case, if people work in multiple departments, now you've got an issue with trying to track that direct labor cost by department. Now, when we start assigning costs to products, so we need to know what our dollar amount is to transfer to the next department. We need to be able to make a journal entry, right? We need to credit work in process department, training department, okay, and debit work in process for the next department, pressing department. To do that, we need to assign the cost of units. We know what happened with the physical units or the equivalent units, where they are. So if we're going to assign cost to that, we need to know, okay, what costs to assign and a per unit cost. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, this is where we run into a difference between the weighted average and the Fifo method. So the weighted average, which we'll look at first, is going to take our work in process cost plus the current period cost and divide it by the work in process equivalent units plus the current period equivalent units. So it kind of blends the beginning and the current. Fifo separates the two. That's the difference. And calculates the equivalent units a little differently. Okay? I mean, not the equivalent units and the cost per equivalent units. So let's do it using the full 5 steps using the weighted average. Start again, okay, with our, remember we're talking about the shredding department. We started with 20, added 92. We have 112. So we need to make sure we know where 112 gallons of pulp went. Well, 96 went to the next department, so that leaves 16 in the current department because there has to be 112, right? We right now are making the assumption that none of it disappears. It doesn't evaporate. It doesn't become waste or any of the things like that. That if 112,000 go in, 112,000 have to either go out or are still there. That's your choices. So once we have that, we calculate the equivalent units by simply adding the transferred out. And notice we have a column for materials and a column for conversion costs. Because we're going to calculate equivalent unit for both separately. Because materials, all the transferred out units are fully done, and that's the same for conversion materials. But the ones that are still being worked on, the materials are finished, which means that you have a full 16,000. But for conversion costs, remember they're only 30% finished. And so that's only 4,800. So we add those two together. Remember, with weighted average, we're adding together the equivalent units. The transferred out and the work in process at the ending. Get 112 for materials and 100,800 for conversion. All right, so that's the difference. If there's a different percent complete, then you need a different column. Total costs. Remember we talked about this. This is what is in work in process. Notice you need to know for this how much is materials and how much is conversion. That would have to be given to you from your beginning work in process. The current costs added, materials, conversion, again, we have to separate the two. But that's relatively easy because we have been making our journal entries as we bought stuff and paid for things during the month. Now we take our total costs. Remember, this is what we have from our costs earlier, right? And we divide by the equivalent units that we also calculated earlier. Make sure you take the cost divided by equivalent units, not the other way around. It's always cost divided by the equivalent units. And we get 90 cents per equivalent unit for materials and $2.20 for conversion cost per equivalent unit. So we've converted all the units, everything we worked on, into equivalent units so that we can add them together, treat them like they're the same, and calculate how much cost it takes to get that much work done. So now we're getting ready to make a journal entry. We need what got transferred and what is still in work in process. Well, we know that 96,000 units were transferred, and we know that those 96,000 cost 90 cents for materials and $2.20 for conversion. So add those two amounts together, we get $297,600. We would credit work in process shredding. We would debit work in process pressing for $297,600. That's the cost of those units that got transferred. The costs that are still in work in process at the end of the month, $16,000, right, from our earlier. Right there, $16,000 from this slide, times 90 cents, same cost per unit, and the $4,800 from our step 2 calculation of equivalent units, just the ones that are in the any work in process, times $2.20, same cost per unit we got in step 4. Cost for materials in work, $14,400, $10,560 for conversion costs. Total should be in our work in process T account at the end of March is $24,960. When we get ready to do this again for April, remember, we knew how much the materials and labor, material and conversion costs were as March 1st. When we do April 1st, whoops, went too far. We will use $14,400 and $10,560 to go on to April and do the same process again. We always want to check to make sure that our total costs assigned are our total cost to account for. And there it is. There's our total cost to account for. $322,560, consistent. And we have found a place for all of our costs. Nothing disappeared. This whole process, or 5-step process, is sometimes referred to as the production cost report. Okay? And you can see as we go through this report, it really is just the same thing. We do the physical units. We calculate the equivalent units. Okay? We have our costs. We calculate the cost per equivalent unit. We calculate the cost transferred out, the cost in ending inventory. All right? It's just a organized, systematic way to do it in an Excel spreadsheet to go through the 5 steps. Once you put your formulas in for each thing, the next month and the next month and the next month will become relatively easy to do. All right. Now, how would it be different if we use first in, first out, or FIFO? All right. Step 1 is exactly the same. You got to know where all your gallons of pulp are. Work in process beginning, what you started, transferred out, work in process, okay, at the ending. That has got to be the same, regardless of the method. So this is exactly the same. So don't worry about learning the second way of doing that, okay? The equivalent units, because we're separating them, is different, okay? Now there's a couple ways of doing this. This one shows, all right, you add up from beginning, started and completed. If you had completed and transferred out 96, then you must have started, and you started with 20, you must have started and completed 76, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have had 96 to transfer out. Okay? It then does the ending work in process the same way as we did before. The difference is then we subtract out what had already been done the month before. So notice that we subtract out the 20,000 because that was all done. This beginning work in process was all done the month before. Sorry, got too carried away. Okay. But on the conversion, we are going to subtract out the only 5,000. What was the 5,000? That's what was already done before. That was 20,000 units that were 25% complete. When did that 25% get done? In February. We're only want March, so we subtract out the 5,000. Another way to do this is to start with this step here, beginning work in process, and think of it in this case. Not put the whole amount, put the amount you had to do in March. So for materials, that would be 0 because you didn't have to do any more work to your beginning work in process in terms of material. You didn't have to add any more materials in March to your beginning work in process. Or on the conversion side, you would then put this as 15 because you had already done 25%. You need to do 75% in March. 75% of 20,000 is 15,000. So you would have gotten 0 here, 15,000 here. You would have gone through the next step, okay? The ending work in process would be the same, but you wouldn't do this subtracting out. Okay, so if you would change, this 20 minus this 20 is the same as just putting 0 here and stopping there. 20 minus the 5 is the same as putting 15 here and stopping there. You would get the same result. Okay? Either way, materials, the work that was actually done in March, 92,000 for materials, 95,800 for conversion. Now, the costs to assign is the same. We still have to account for all of our costs. That's no different regardless of our method, okay, or our assumption. But when we calculate the cost per equivalent unit, we only use the current costs, only the 84,640 that were added, right? Only the 213,624 that were added. So only the current costs, only the current equivalent units. Get 92 cents and $2.23. So our cost per equivalent unit gets slightly different based on this assumption. Assigning our costs to what we've done. Okay? we need to calculate how much gets transferred, right, to the next department. What you need to do is add up the cost from beginning work in process, cost to complete, okay, the beginning work in process, and the current cost of those that are units that are started and completed. You see the calculations down here. 76,000 times 92. We're using that 92 cents. 76,000 times $2.23. Remember that 15,000 I mentioned in the kind of the other way of doing the. That's how much work had to be done to these units to get them finished before they're ready to be transferred. So this is the same as the weighted average we learned earlier. But then we have this extra step, and then we have this calculated a little differently because it's only those units that are started and completed. We still add it together, and we get the total cost transferred of $297,136, which is slightly different than what we got when we did it the weighted average method. And we still split our work in process by using the same thing, 16,000 equivalent units, all of our materials, but we use the 92 cents per equivalent unit, okay, and the 4,800 times 223 to get our cost per equivalent unit for the conversion costs. So this is what would be in work in process total, and this would be the breakdown between the two for materials and conversion costs. So you get a slightly different, and most people would say immaterial difference, okay? In real life, you pick one and stick with it. You don't go back and forth. You would probably do it the same for all of your products. There's no rules to say that you have to for each department, but I would think that no one really wants to go back and forth between the two. Pick one, get used to it, set up your spreadsheets that way, and that's why you do it. We just want you to be able to do both in this class. Which one's better? Okay, there's not really a better. FIFO is going to be more focused on our current costs, okay, and it's going to be changed faster than the weighted average if things change in the current period because it's not averaged together. So, for instance, if you did better on the last test, okay, than the one previous, you probably would rather have more focus on the current test than on the old test. Okay? Weighted average is just going to average them together. FIFO is going to put more emphasis on the current. In this scenario, you see the difference is very small. All right? In fact, most people would say an immaterial difference that doesn't really matter, okay, for our management decisions. Probably wouldn't be a key thing in terms of costs that we would, what our price would be, our profitability. This small change could be. Now, well, again, this increase in costs that we find in FIFO is going to happen faster under FIFO if our costs are increasing. We'll get that signal faster than if we use weighted average because it's kind of averaged in with some old units in the weighted average method. Now, we do want to put in our heads that the idea that when you have multiple departments, so in our case, the shredding department, then the pressing department, then the bottling or whatever, packaging department, okay? When you do this whole thing for the pressing department, costs come from the shredding department. You don't have to make things overly complicated to make sure that you consider those costs from the other department. Because remember, we do want to separate those costs because chances are the supervisor for shredding is different than the supervisor for the pressing department. And so if we're going to try to evaluate and see how they're doing in terms of managing costs, we need to, while ultimately all the costs are important for all the departments, we want to separate them so that we can have some way of determining who's doing their job better than, they might have been doing in the past. Okay? So what happens, and what the way to think about this is, costs that come from the previous department, instead of having two columns, remember we had two columns when we were calculating equivalent units, are transferred, all of our costs added. We had materials and conversion costs, two columns. Just have a third column and call it cost transferred in. Treat them as just another direct material, another material added. Because that's what they really are. What you're taking is the shredded pulp from the shredding department and you're putting it into the other one. And then in the pressing department, you may add more materials, which you see will be going in our raw materials or direct materials column. And you're going to add more labor and overhead. That would go in our conversion column. But the costs that came from the department, the shredding department, would be a third column or separate. Okay, so just a quick reminder of when to use job costing, process costing. Okay, I think we've talked about this previously. And then we'll wrap up with kind of a review again of operation costing, because we talked about it in chapter 6, but you hadn't really seen process costing at that point. So we told you it was a combination, okay, a hybrid, but that maybe you just kind of check that off as not that critical. Now that we know both job costing and process costing, we better understand how the hybrid might work, okay? Typically, it is done when there is, by batches, that we have common processes but different materials. So, for instance, the sports company has two types of snowmobiles, all right? They go through a similar process, but the Ocelot has a larger engine and has more expensive materials and is customized to some extent. So, while they both go through an assembly process, they both go through a painting process that we will handle like a process, the materials that go into them are separate and therefore would be tracked very much like a job costing scenario. The customization that happens only for the Ocelots, any additional things, would be treated as a job cost type scenario, because it's very easy to see when it starts and stops. It's not just going to everything. Everything's a little different. The customer gets to pick and choose what they want on their Ocelot, I guess, which is not available on the Tiger. So that's where you would then have pieces of both. So you would track the direct materials, do the equivalent units you would do not equivalent units. You would track by job or by batch the materials going into it, the customization. But the assembly and painting processes would be treated just like a process costing. You'd have equivalent units. You'd have which one, how many units went by, and you may not even differentiate between tigers and ocelots at that point, because the process assembly and painting may be so similar as to be not distinguishable between the two. They both have to be painted the same way.